can have some companies, if you get in early, they'll return 10 times, 20 times, or even 50 times your original investment.
That's always the goal for growth investors. But knowing how to find these companies before they take off is the key.
Where are investors making tens or hundreds of billions of dollars with new technologies and entirely new markets?
Tech expert and growth investor Simon Erickson with 7 Investing dives into 3 new areas of tech with strong growth potential ahead.
There's over 40,000 applications for new satellites to go into orbit. That's 4x the total number of satellites that we have out there. You're going to start seeing some big deals.
Simon shares specific growth stocks he's watching in these sectors, but also some crucial guidance on how to manage risk.
If you're really, really good as a growth style investor, this might blow your mind, but you'll be wrong 4 times out of 10.
Could you find the next big company that will transform your finances? Let's dive in. Simon, so great to have you with us today. Really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your knowledge and expertise with us. I know you've been working with growth stocks specifically in the tech sector for quite a while now.
Bridget, it's such a pleasure to be on your program. Thank you for having me here this afternoon.
Yeah, let's dive right into growth stocks. Today, I know we want to talk about 3 areas of tech that have a lot of growth opportunity in the future. But before we get to those 3 new areas, let's talk about the biggest area of growth the market has seen in years, and that is AI. So many investors made so much money with some of these big AI companies seeing just explosive growth over the last couple of years. Is there still room left for that kind of growth in the AI sector?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the perfect way to describe, where we're going next, is to look at where we've gone first. Right? I tend to like to call these super cycles. Where are investors making tens or hundreds of billions of dollars with new technologies and entirely new markets? In the last couple of years, there's really been 2 of them. One was cloud computing, and one was the first stages of AI. We all realized a couple of years ago that it was pretty expensive to build these giant data centers, to do all these things that we wanted them to do for our websites, for our applications. And so at first we just said, you know what, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, you guys take care of this for us. We're going to rent out space and computing and storage off of your servers for infrastructure as a service. And so all of a sudden the cloud computing industry comes to be. And then we started asking them to do more difficult things, right? AI, the first wave of it was, yeah, we've got these AI models. They're pretty neat out there, but they're going to take a lot of computing. And there's going to be some real expensive processors that are going to be involved with that. And so the companies, the cloud titans, the Microsofts and the Amazons of the world, they went out there to NVIDIA and they said, hey, we need some really high performance computing processors. NVIDIA has been one of the biggest winners of the first phase of AI, which is all about the hardware and those computing processors. That's kind of laying the scene, Bridget, for where we're going next. But we got some pretty cool infrastructure in place to do some really neat things out there.
Yeah, and it's all of that infrastructure has been so good for investors, but right now that's not really the hottest spot in the market. And I think growth investors who are used to getting this kind of 200% returns in just a year, that explosive growth, they're looking for that again. And you have a list of 3 areas of technology, 3 new trends that have that potential for explosive growth. And the first one is very related to AI. Let's dive into this area that you want to share with investors today.
Yeah, absolutely. I would call it AI software is kind of the phase that we're in right now. We've seen NVIDIA make a ton of money, and there's other companies like AMD has just now introduced its own GPU for the data center. There's new companies like Cerebras, which is probably going to IPO later this year or next. Like, we've got the hardware piece of this figured out. We've got some really high-tech processors in those data centers. Now it's who's going to be using that for the best good for their own software. And so I would call this AI software is where we are right now. This is a good example. Palantir is kind of the quintessential example of this. This is a company that kind of worked originally with the US government, Department of Defense, really was able to find the needles in haystacks of lots of complex data. And then they realized that they could actually use that for commercial enterprises as well. And so that's why you see Palantir's top line growing 50% or faster. It's actually accelerating in recent quarters because every commercial enterprise in America right now wants to use this artificial intelligence platform. This is where, if you have a whole bunch of information and you want to say, hey, rather than mining through all this on my own, can't you just ask a question that will reliably give me the most accurate answer of all? If we're in South Dakota and we really want people to learn about investing in stocks, where should they go? Go to MarketBeat. Go to listen to this podcast would be the answer it would give to us. But you think about, hospitals, really large organizations. That was the first phase of Palantir. It's going into a new phase too. AI software, there's a couple other examples too, Bridget, if you want to talk about some other companies, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, Palantir is such a good example, and a stock many of our viewers, our retail investors are familiar with and got in on early. They were in on Palantir even before it got to $20, and now it's trading, we all know, much higher than that. And I think what they're looking for is that next Palantir. What is the next AI software company that could see that kind of explosive growth?
You know, one that really isn't quite as popular, at least not making as many headlines as Palantir, is a company called Duolingo. The ticker on that is DUOL. This is an education company. And education has been a tough space to crack. For people that have invested in this in the past, whether it's Rosetta Stone, whether it's 2U, whatever the companies were, a lot of it's a very difficult business to compete in. But really, Duolingo is a computer software company. It's led by a computer scientist, Luis von Ahn, really a guy that kind of invented crowdsourcing and this relentless A and B testing. And the way that it fits in so nicely with Duolingo is it's kind of a personalized experience for everyone who's trying to learn another language. So if we're trying to learn how to speak Dutch, speak French, learn Swahili, learn Valkyrian, Klingon, there's 40 languages on the Duolingo platform you can learn, and it actually customizes the lesson plan based on how you're interacting with the site. And so for a very simple subscription, a membership, $84 a year for that. They also do a lot of advertising, but it's really core of this platform is using AI to tailor it to the individual student. And this is a company that has learned how to use AI, kind of the innovator really early on, and is using it to kind of open up an industry that hasn't had the advantage of using this in the past.
Yeah, like you said earlier, with all of the information that AI is giving us, the companies that have the chance to make that money in the future are the ones who know how to harness that. And Duolingo is a great example of that. I'm wondering, for many of these companies that are harnessing AI and helping to sell that as a product, are we still early enough for investors to have a lot of room to run with these companies?
100%. We're really in probably the second inning. If you think about it, just kind of like how cloud computing has looked, you need to lay all the infrastructure to actually do the processing. Then it's like we're just now understanding, even what the software layer of this can do. If you go online, you look for machine learning specialists or generative AI specialists. I mean, these are high dollar jobs that companies are just now starting to post out there. And so, you think of companies like Duolingo, think of companies like Palantir. Another one that I really like, the Trade Desk that's out there for digital advertising. You're starting to see companies realize, hey, we've got a ton of information. We can either make our operations more efficient by using AI to save on costs, or we can make our platform even more valuable by enhancing it in some certain way. I think we're very, very early still, Bridget. I think there's plenty of money to be made in this field.
All right, so AI software is one area to get in early with you see companies that are going to be successful. Before we get to your second one, my one other question for each of these sectors that we're going to talk about is where there might be some risk. We know with any new technology, you have a lot of startups, and some will do really, really well, and others will not do so well. In this area specifically, in AI software, what's some advice for investors on how to tell the difference between a company with real potential and one that might just be around for a year or two before it fails?
That is a fantastic question, because this is a very different part of investing than a lot of other, safer types of investing. It's almost like venture capital investing in a lot of ways. You're going to be wrong, and you can't expect that you're going to get hit or a home run on every one of these. In fact, if you're really, really good as a growth style investor, this might blow your mind, but you'll be wrong 4 times out of 10. You only have about a 60% hit rate. Will even outperform the broader market. They say, Simon, how can that possibly make sense? Why don't I just invest in the S&P? And of course, the answer is by the math. You're going to have some companies, if you get in early, they'll return 10 times, 20 times, or even 50 times your original investment. And we've seen at 7 Investing examples of each one of those. It's just because you can allow them to compound as they're so early, and the winners will tend to win even more and get even larger over time. And the second part of your question is, what should we look for? That's a good question too, is execution. Every growth style company that's going out there and pitching what they're doing is going to show the hockey stick. It's going to show the total addressable market that's worth $100 billion. It's going to talk about why it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But the reality is, most of them will not. And so you're going to look for execution. Typically it exhibits an S curve, where growth is really slow, and all of a sudden you start seeing some big contracts coming in. And then what does every other company want to do? They don't want to get left behind their competitors. So they're going to do the exact same thing. They don't want you to see 1 or 2 big hits. These companies' growth and their revenues and their profits skyrocket in a short amount of time, maybe 2 or 3 years. And so if you can catch it right before that S-curve, that's where you really start to get the best returns as an investor. But great question. There's definitely higher risk when you're a growth style investor as well.
Yeah, you have to be ready for the risk, but again, there's a huge reward, and that is the viewers that we're talking to right now that are looking for those big potential rewards. We talked about the AI software as one area that's kind of up and coming in tech. This next area has been a buzzword since late last year, early this year, and that's quantum computing. I want to hear your take on whether there is some money to be made for growth investors in the quantum computing investing space.
It's amazing to finally seeing them getting some love, Bridget, in quantum computing. There was a 4-year period that I went to a technical conference every single month for 4 years. And this was early at MIT where they were talking about quantum computing, and people who were much smarter than me were getting on stage talking about how excited they were, PhDs and postdoctors, about this new form of computing. And everyone else was kind of scratching their head saying, what are you even talking about? What is quantum computing? For the last 7 decades, we've kind of built a computing infrastructure that's intended to do classical computing, right? If you go back to even the earliest transistors in the late 50s and the early 60s, and then Silicon Valley, everything was silicon-based. Everything was binary, zeros and ones, the way we were storing information. We had CPUs and we had GPUs, but it was still code being written and then run in series or parallel, and it was based on zeros and ones, right? And if you're flipping a coin in the air, you're flipping a quarter in the air, you could only really see if it was heads or tails at the end. Is it a 0 or 1? Is the transistor on or off? And the really smartest minds in this industry said, what if we could look at these things in more of a wave function, where at any point in the air, you could see exactly where that quarter was, and it didn't have to be such a binary outcome. And so we've started talking in terms of things like qubits instead of bits, and things like block spheres instead of transistors. Quantum gates are a completely different type of science and a completely different type of technology than we've developed for the last 70 years. But the beauty of it is that they can handle an enormous amount of inputs and solve problems that were completely unsolvable before. And even though we've got AI software that's already doing some of this cool stuff today, it's still limited by the types of processors and the types of computing that's being done in those data centers. So imagine now today that you can actually build a quantum computer that all of a sudden you can throw millions of inputs at, and it would immediately solve all of them simultaneously. So this is kind of unlocking a lot of creativity for entrepreneurs, and those companies that are really trying to solve some of the hardest problems are considering quantum. And once you start seeing some hits from that, it's probably going to bleed into the rest of the commercial markets as well.
I think the question with quantum, like you said, it's been around for a while, a buzzword, and really generating a lot of excitement because of the potential and the potential uses for this technology once it comes. But the big question investors have is, how long is the reality of this actually happening? If you're getting in early, how long could you have to wait before this investment pays off when we actually have a functioning, useful quantum computer that can be commercialized?
The answer is always 10 years, Bridget. And then two years after you say that, then you also say 10 years, so everyone forgets how long it is. It's something that's been a science project for so long, right? Like even just the experts in this field are debating what is the right way to build a quantum computer. One that's gotten a lot of, it's kind of a trade-off between how fast do you want it to go versus how stable do you want it to be. The qubit stability versus the gate speed of the quantum transistors and the quantum gates. So it's something that still is a lot of debate out there, but the interesting thing is that we are starting to see some publicly traded quantum computing stocks now. Now, one that I like to talk about is IonQ. This is one that went public through a SPAC. It was the first pure play quantum computing when it hit the market just a couple of years ago. They're in the ion trapping technology. They've gotten a lot of interest right now. And the thing that I think that is interesting, to directly address your question about why now, is this still just a science project? In all of last year, in 2024, they did $42 million in total revenue. And just when they went public just a couple years before that, it was only $1 million in revenue. So you've already seen a 40x increase from science project that got a little bit of funding to actually some contracts out there. And then get this, Bridget, they just signed a deal with the United States Air Force, wants to start experimenting with quantum computing for its own infrastructure. And that 4-year deal was worth $54 million. So one contract worth more than all of the previous year's revenue, which is already 40x in the last 2 years. You're starting to see the resemblance of that S-curve where it's picking up really quickly out there. I think that it's still very early to the game, but at least when you start seeing deals like that being signed, there's something to this. It's not just an idea anymore.
Yeah, there's a little less risk when you can see there is actual contracts and money being made. I want to get into the risks investors should be prepared for, but first I want to hear your take on two other names we've talked about on this channel before in quantum computing, and that's Regetti and DWave. We've done a few different videos on them because they're stocks that people are talking about in this space. Any thoughts on those two companies in particular?
Rigetti, not as much. That's not one that I'm too familiar with just now, so I'll reserve commenting on that one. I do know that DWave has been around a lot longer. This is quantum annealing. Alan Barretts is the CEO of that company. He's kind of been a long time computing guy, is really kind of pushing for this technology. It's really good for optimization problems. There's different types of ideas of what you could use quantum computing for. And so the traveling salesman is a perfect optimization problem. If I wanted to go from South Dakota to Houston to Boston to China and perfectly optimize every single flight that I would take offered by any airline out there, and I wanted the answer right now, how can you optimize that? That would be something like a quantum annealer from D-Wave Systems could do. But there's even more complex quantum computing problems out there. Maybe it's molecular. Maybe you're a drug developer that wants to perfectly align all of the molecules of a new cancer drug and see how it's going to interact with the body so you can get it to the exact right target at exactly the right time. Something like that would be very difficult for D-Wave to do. That's why you're starting to see new technologies, even within quantum computing, kind of a broad term, but there's different approaches depending on what you're trying to solve. I honestly think, Bridget, there's going to be a bunch of quantum computing companies that are going to win, and then you're going to start seeing like these segments of customers where it's the best fit for them.
Yeah, very interesting. And that leads to the question on this sector as well. You're going to see a lot more of these companies. How do you determine which could be winners and which couldn't? And then maybe just an overall risk in this category. And maybe part of that risk is just we don't know that timeline on when that full technology is going to be available.
There tends to be kind of batches of when companies want to raise money and go public. If you look back in 2021, that was kind of the SPAC phase. I know that everyone who's watching this video is familiar with how much money was raised by companies on every industry out there when the money was there for the taking. And it certainly has dipped a little bit in the last couple of years since interest rates have gone up and then there's various other factors out there. But I think that we're going to start seeing a lot of demand for new quantum computing companies as soon as kind of that window opens up again for companies to go public. One that I've got my eye on is Quantinuum. This is a company that is majority owned by Honeywell, of all companies, who is doing kind of some research with building the quantum computers. They went out and worked with an interface, a dashboard where you could actually define the problems, kind of like Windows was used for a user to make sense of computing in the early days of computing. Something like that's integrated, and then also has a cybersecurity piece of it built in. I think the next phase is just like we talked about with AI hardware, now going to AI software. I think it's going to be quantum hardware first. And now all of a sudden you've got some stability with the qubits. You've got a quantum computer that doesn't have interference. They can reliably start doing some processing out there. Once we have the hardware piece in place, then the really fun part comes, which is going to be kind of the larger ecosystem in the software layer too. So to answer your question, when is it going to happen? I think that you're going to start seeing a lot of companies coming public in the quantum space within the next year or 2 years. Then you're going to start seeing some technology budgets, especially from those larger companies going into quantum. And you're going to start seeing some big deals, just like we saw with IonQ, with some of the smaller players as well.
So for investors, when you hear that timeline of maybe the next couple of years, and maybe a few years after that before you get that financial investment from industries and businesses out there, when is a good time as an investor to get in, depending on your risk tolerance?
It's always personal, right? It's hard to say for anybody, but one thing that I always like to do is start very small. Just put $100 into a stock that you want to keep an investment in for the next 3 or 5 years. Or if it just doesn't work out and you say, hey, look, this one failed along the way, remembering the statistic from before, only 6 out of 10, 3 out of 5 is actually going to outperform the broader S&P. And the ones that fail sometimes can fail spectacularly, the liquidity risks, the risk of bankruptcy of being early, the risk of talent moving around in these industries. I mean, just like venture capitalists, they'll wait for one Twitter out there or one really, really big hit out there like Facebook that will offset all of the losses that they have elsewhere. This isn't quite as aggressive as venture capital investing, but you've got to kind of set the risk parameters and your own tolerance up front. But I do think that, rather than just say, hey, we're going to go back the truck up on IonQ right now, because I heard that quantum computing is the next big thing, it might not hurt to, take a small stake in something that you're interested in following along with and seeing how it develops over the next couple of years.
Really good advice to approach these growth stocks in more of a safe manner, a little more cautious approach to getting involved in growth stocks. That's a really good take on what's happening in quantum computing. I want to get to our final sector to talk about, and that's heading into the space sector. A lot of our viewers are interested in some of these up and coming companies that are really in a little bit of a space race right now for different reasons too. What's your take on this sector?
Oh, people are setting up shop in outer space now, Bridget. It's amazing what's going on in orbit, right? This was something that a couple of years ago was just reserved for the federal government and Star Trek. And all of a sudden now, these satellites are no longer the size of buses. They're the sizes of vending machines, and the small sats are even just, cubes. CubeSats are very, very small, and you can place them into orbit to do a variety of different things. And of course, when the launch costs come down and the satellite construction and manufacturing costs comes down to a point that's affordable for commercial enterprises, you start unlocking the creativity of the Richard Bransons and the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks of the world to say, what can we do in outer space? Of course, the most obvious answer that we've seen Elon and others pursuing first was satellite-based internet, where you didn't have to build these giant terrestrial towers anymore. You could actually have satellites just like Starlink that are beaming down high-speed broadband internet to all corners of the world. But there are other opportunities as well. There's a company called Planet Labs. PL is the ticker on that one. It's got CubeSats that every 90 minutes are circling around the entire world, taking basically real-time imagery of everything that's going on. And so everyone from the Brazilian government to the Department of Defense to even logistics and shipping companies are really interested to see, how is deforestation going in South America versus where are troops going in conflict areas versus, what's the most efficient way for me to send my ships to avoid storms that might be, hitting the shipping that we're doing internationally. You just start thinking if you can go a layer above and look down at the Earth or even start doing some transmission of things from outer space. There's a lot of opportunity in outer space right now. And Bridget, there's a really neat statistic that I wanted to kind of show just how big of a deal this might be. There's about 13,000 active satellites in outer space right now. That's gone up. It's doubled in the last couple of years. But the FCC, who grants spectrum for satellites, so they won't interfere with one another, right? So the same idea why your cell phone doesn't interfere with someone else's call. You don't want satellites interfering with each other. So you have to get approval from the FCC for spectrum. Has over 40,000 applications for new satellites to go into orbit. That's 4x the total number of satellites that we have out there. They've overhauled their entire approval and review process to keep up with the massive amount of demand out there. Things like that can be really interesting if you can invest into space like that very, very early.
That is a really good piece of information to show investors how much growth is going to be coming down the pipeline for this sector specifically. 40,000 new applications means a lot of potential growth in this area. Such a good growth industry to talk about. Do you have any other names of specific up-and-coming companies in this space that are going into space and could be really profitable down the road?
Yeah, not even more than a decade ago, it was really hard to even put a satellite into space, right? If you were the government, you had a launch pad, awesome, you can put it up there whenever you want to and you got the funding for it. And then we got used to this thing called ride sharing, which was, there was a really big rocket, right? There's a Falcon rocket, SpaceX is going to go up in outer space. You can kind of piggyback onto them, right? You can wait at the bus stop, get onto the bus, but then you have to get off where the bus is going to stop, right? The orbital plane of where SpaceX wants to go. If you want to get there, that's great. But if it's not going to stop where you want to, Elon's not going to adjust where his rockets are going based on what you want to do. You got to play by his rules. And sometimes it would take 18 months to even launch your satellite into space based on the available calendar. A company called Rocket Lab, RKLB, is a publicly traded option that's actually trying to democratize space launch. Where you can actually you can go on their website, you go to Rocket Lab right now. Bridget, if you wanted to spend $5 to $7 million, you could actually launch your own satellite in exactly where you want to, and Rocket Lab will do that for you. Kind of democratizing outer space for small commercial customers. And so $5 million, that's actually pretty affordable for companies, especially telecoms, to put something in outer space for their own operations. A company like that tends to start small, right? 300 kilograms, $5 to $7 million per launch. Kind of getting a history of launches, getting some credibility and trust out there, and then they start working their way up market. Where now all of a sudden this year, later in the fall of 2025, they're going to launch an even larger rocket. They used to launch Electron, which could carry 300 kilograms of payload. Now they're going to launch Neutron, which can launch 10 tons. 10,000 kilograms of payload, right? So all of a sudden, you go from launching one cool vending machine-sized satellite into one place to putting an entire constellation of satellites all the way into orbit so that you've all of a sudden got operations for telecommunications or whatever you want to. And so Rocket Lab is going to be charging $50 million per launch instead of $7 million per launch. You tend to start seeing an S-curve from something like that. That's really, really good economies of scale. You can get that credibility and trust built early on.
Yeah, we've covered that company on this channel before. It's one growth investors really like because they do see the potential and the growth already happening. It's great to see when those up and coming companies are already starting to get new contracts and new earnings coming in. That's always good to see.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic business. It's been around for a long time. You've got a rocket scientist, Peter Beck, at the helm there. It's a guy that is out there putting his hard hat on and not afraid to roll his sleeves up and get his hands dirty. Kind of an engineer CEO that's very involved with the operations. He's got a lot of credibility. I'm excited to see what they do in the next couple of years.
Well, so much information for our viewers to take in today. Simon, thank you so much for your time and diving into these 3 new areas of tech that are really great options for growth investors. We so appreciate your time today and just all of your expertise. Just for our viewers out there who want to keep connected with you, where can viewers find more of your information on stocks just like these?
Bridget, it was a real pleasure to be on your show today. Thank you very much for having me. My website is 7investing.com, where every single month we make new stock recommendations, and they also provide 5 best buys every month, not just in quantum computing and space economy things, but across the full gamut of investing styles. It's the first of the month here today as we're recording this, so our new recommendation actually just went live a couple of hours ago.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for your time, Simon. We hope you'll check out some of our other videos, some that mentioned several of the companies we talked about here today. We'll put those links in the description of the video too. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and as always, happy investing.